I'd just like to start I have the privilege of starting because I'm on stage by saying that Orlando really did change my life. It was the first art house film that I'd ever seen. I was 14 and I came out a different person. Not just that it changed my ideas about art and life, it changed my ideas about who I was allowed to fall in love with, i.e. everyone. Because everyone in the film looks so beautiful and is shot with such respect and intimacy. But it actually made me an activist as well. Shortly after seeing the film, I had an altercation with a security guard at Heathrow Airport, which ended with me telling him to bend my gender. Something I highly advise doing this to someone in authority because they have no idea what to do with that instruction, and that set me on the course of both artistic and political activism, and I think that's the case for many people. Patrick Wolf has spoken about how his musical persona derived from the film, and I know that many of the people here this evening will have been inspired by it in many ways. And so I just want to ask you, Sally and Tilda, when you set out to make this film 20 years ago, when you started writing it, did you have a sense of how big an impact this film was going to have and just how important it was going to be?
I don't think we were dreaming in quite that way. I don't think we were thinking about impact or importance. I think we were just totally immersed in making something happen and taking it through and around all manner of strange obstacles and so on until it came into being. But I don't think there was a predictive sense, other than the one that we were just talking about, which is that one day in the future, possibly 20 years later, we might be together on a platform somewhere talking about it. I think that was about as much of our future gazing that I can remember.
I mean, the fact is that what was between us on the table when we first had a conversation about this film 5 years before it was ever on celluloid, was Virginia Woolf's book, which by then had inspired our Bones and generations of other people of all genders. And the great task was to approach the idea of making a film that might touch us, let alone anybody else, in the way in which, or in a similar way in which that book had touched us. So it was a tall order, and we did have 5 years of people telling us it was impossible. That's sort of part of the course, I now realise. When you want to adapt anything worth adapting, there's always many more people telling you that it's impossible. And I'm beginning to realise that's a good sign, because it means it might be worth the effort. But I think that the kernel of that book, the kernel of the idea of Orlando in Virginia Woolf's hands, was such a depth charge for so many people. But as I say, that in a way made it an even taller order, because to even get close to that, let alone dance around it or replicate it in any way, felt impossible.
So you had the kernel of the book, and over the course of 5 years, you turned it into the film that we've watched this evening. And I'm just curious about the elements of that process, because you worked together for quite a long time for a performer and a director, took some wonderful photos in rehearsal for the character, and I understand also worked towards the idea of the to-camera gaze and asides. And I'd just like to hear a bit about how you came to that process, because in the film it seems so natural and so perfect, as if it must have been the first idea that you had.
The to-camera stuff?
The to-camera stuff, the monologues, and the creation of the character.
Well, my memory of it. You know, one of the things that Tilda has an astonishing sense of comic timing. And one of the things that characterises the memories for me of the working process is enormous reams of uncontrollable laughter. that could be sparked by a glance, and a particular kind of knowing glance. And I think when you've been sort of shoulder to shoulder and kind of hand in hand through a long process, and you develop kind of codes of understanding and nicknames, and mine is potato, for example, you go into a slightly different area where even a glance signifies incredible complicity, not just about the project in hand, but about all the processes that you've shared and gone through. And I think also Tilda, read out loud to me, which I now realise is a rare thing, but possibly didn't at the time, something like 200 drafts, successive drafts. And, when she could smell a turkey, that look would come, she would glance up at me with a certain look. And so I think, there was a lot of looking, let's say, direct looking, this kind of looking in the process at different stages. So I think it was kind of there as a seed. And then I do kind of remember a conversation where we talked about finding an equivalent for Virginia Woolf's direct address to the reader, which she does a lot through the book. And it's kind of obvious, actually. It's a direct link, a direct address with the audience across the lens.
And also, as I remember, at that time, one of the things that people said to us, because you have to remember that when we started this idea, because Sally and I knew each other very slightly through Derek Jarman. I think we met on a march, I was remembering the other day in Hyde Park. And we knew each other a little bit. And one day, you rang me up and asked me to tea. And on this table plonked down a copy of Orlando. We had nothing but that. We had a joint mutual love of this book. We had no script. We had no producer. We had no money. We had no reputation. We had nothing but an enthusiasm for this book. And this extraordinary thing, which was this complicit idea. And the more we talked over that 5 years, the more we realized that our ideas were very similar, sparked by this book. We had nothing but that. And so that was the thing, that complicity was the only thing we had going for us. It's the only thing we could get back to. When we started to think about trying to raise any kind of support, and this was even, the wonderful, again, nickname, I call him Cubby Broccoli, Christopher Shepherd, who's our producer, at that time was not producing, he was a documentary filmmaker and producer of his own documentary films. When he came on board, or we started as these three complete renegades with nothing really to go on at all, when we started to think about raising money for the project, we realized that we had an idea of how I might look. That's all we had. So we hired a couple of costumes from Berman's and Nathan's, a female costume and a male costume, and we dressed up and we did a photo shoot and we made a book and we took it to Cannes. and all the while having a real laugh and also building up enormous debts. But with this spirit of, we don't know what we're doing, but we're still interested. We're still interested in each other, and we're still being fed by this strange kind of grail of this book and this idea of this film. And so we kept building on this very simple thing, which was the look and the look. And then the other thing that springs to my mind now is that at that time when we started asking people what they thought about the idea of us doing this film, generally speaking, they would say to us, money people, they would say to us, a costume film? Because at that time, nobody made costume films. The only people who made costume films were Merchant Ivory. And their kind of attitude to costume films, as we saw it, was, generally speaking, and I'm being reductive for the sake of time, so I apologize if it sounds rude, but was, generally speaking, nostalgic and hagiographic about a kind of traditional grid. And we knew for sure that whatever we did, in any costume, whatever, we wanted to rock that. We wanted to keep some kind of present contact between the audience and the character.